On Press Perspective today, we touch upon various social issues here that made foreign headlines, ranging from Korea's low birth rate to fake news. Do stay with us. Hello and welcome to Press Perspective. It's Friday, May 23rd here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. It's that time of the week yet again during which we address a collection of diverse social stories here on the local front that made international headlines as well. For this, I have Kelly Kasulis Cho with the Washington Post here in the studio. Kelly, it's good to have you here.
Happy to be here, thanks.
I also have writer Colin Marshall with us. Colin, welcome back.
Thank you.
Right, Kelly, a growing number of young Koreans have been found to approve of having children outside of wedlock. Let's start with details of that particular finding.
Yeah, I was really shocked by an article I saw covering this in the past week. South Korea is certainly known as a country where childbirth is heavily tied to marriage, and where there's very little childbirth happening at all, right? So the fertility rate in South Korea in the last couple of years has hovered around 0.75, which for the Korean population to continue at the pace that it to replace the number of people who pass away every year, you need more like a fertility rate or a birth rate of 2.1. So it's the lowest birth rate in the world and the fastest aging population in the world. So I find it interesting that now there is, this is according to survey data, but that there's a purported destigmatization happening of having children outside of wedlock. So basically what was reported was the government of South Korea commissioned a recent study, which they've been doing a lot of this because they want to look at the fertility and the birth rate issue in the country. And it shows that women in their 20s in 2008, about 28.4% of them surveyed said that they support childbirth out of wedlock. And in 2024, it rose to 42.4%. And you see a similar phenomenon with men in their 20s, men in their 30s, women in their 30s as well. What's interesting about that, though, is that even if there's less stigma towards having children out of wedlock, it certainly isn't necessarily playing out in the birth rate in this country. It continues to get worse over time. And the other interesting factoid that I found in that article was, and I didn't know this, looking at OECD nations, about 40%, slightly above 40% of children are born outside of a civil union or a marriage. In Korea, that figure is like 5%. So, I think the reason why this was covered was largely because the government as well as the media is continuously looking at this birth rate issue and looking at ways that we can fix it. And I think some people maybe saw, less stigma towards having children outside of a marriage as potentially a positive thing. But it doesn't really seem to be doing anything for the country's performance in terms of dealing with the population crisis.
Right, which is why some population pundits, they are saying the prejudice against women who have children outside of marriage should be addressed to boost birth rates. Kelly mentioned the statistics. Let's work on that. Colin, what do these statistics tell us about the present level of prejudice against women who have children outside of wedlock here in the country? And what have been some of your observations here?
Well, as Kelly mentioned, these surveys were about not just women, but also men who father children out of wedlock. But the numbers track fairly closely on both sides of that fence. And as Kelly also mentioned, the numbers were going from sort of 20% approval to 40% approval. So it's a big jump, but that's still a minority of the population who on a survey says they approve of having a child out of wedlock. Now, in the US, where I'm from, there are a lot fewer teen moms than there used to be. I mean, I recall when I was in high school in circa 2000, there'd be sort of one or two in the school you'd know of. Now it seems to be becoming a thing of the past. And the United States also is having its own, I don't know if it reaches the level of problem, but having its own problems with fertility as well, with the birth rate. It's been falling. And part of that is to do with how well, you could say, campaigns against teen pregnancy have gone in the U.S. That's a big chunk of the fall in the birth rate in the U.S. It's accounted for by how many fewer teen pregnancies there are. So we can say that's a positive social development, but then you look at, you sort of see this discourse that, well, in high school, a lot of girls are told, if you have a baby, it's going to ruin your life, with no statute of limitations. They don't tell you when that condition ends. So for a lot of people, that impression stays with them. If I have a baby, it's going to ruin my life. They'll be, 39 years old or whatever, and they'll still be thinking, what am I going to do if I get pregnant, So in a way, like with the Korean government's efforts in the 70s and 80s to curtail population growth, it was growing too fast. Sometimes you can overcorrect. And with a lot of government efforts, they work in a way, but the effect lags the implementation. So it might not get credited to the administration that put it in place, and it might go too far. The effect might be more than was desired, might be undesirably large. So we'll talk about this more later, I'm sure, but in the run-up to this election, candidates have been mentioning among their promises that they would like to increase support, some of them would, for single-parent households, or financial support specifically for single-parent households. So part of this may be paving the way for that, showing that surveys have indicated a loosening of this idea that it is wrong to have a child out of wedlock. Well, that's sort of step one in getting public opinion primed for a policy such as that.
Right, and staying with the opinion here in the country, Kelly, then. So a growing number of young adults think having children outside of wedlock is okay now. Keeping that in mind, Kelly, in your view, what do you suppose is fueling this shift in perception?
Again, I was actually surprised by the results of this government commission study because it's not something that I'm seeing reflected in my everyday life when I look out in the public. First of all, when I look out in the streets of South Korea, I don't see children everywhere. There's not that many children being born. And it's always when I leave South Korea that I'm reminded of this because, there's children everywhere in Europe and Turkey, even in the United States. And that's when I really feel the disparity living here. And certainly when I do see children, it's usually a straight couple that appears to be married, like a mother and father. Could it be an unwed couple that stayed together? Yes. But even I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't anecdotally actually know of anyone who has had a child outside of marriage here in South Korea. I know it happens, and it happens everywhere around the world, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. The stigma being reduced, I wonder if it's just largely because South Korea is desperate for children, period. And we're seeing kind of this valorization of motherhood slowly kind of happening, where the government is trying to, celebrate mothers, incentivize motherhood, convince women that they are not losing the inroads that they've made as a gender in South Korean society by also choosing to have children. But again, it's quite surprising actually, and I question whether it's showing in the population. As Colin astutely pointed out, it's still under 50% that approve. And I think in general, South Korea has a big issue with people wanting to sign up to have children, even under the most perfect of circumstances, right? So I hear all the time people who want to be mothers or fathers, but they feel like they don't make enough money. And their definition of enough money is actually quite an aspirational amount of money. It's not enough just to put your kids to a decent school and to feed them. You also want to dress them in brand name clothes and be able to save to send them to Harvard potentially, right? So I think South Korea actually has such stringent standards for what would make the good circumstances of parenthood, that whether or not as a society we shame women or men for having children outside of wedlock, I don't know if that's going to have a big effect, at least in the short term, for dealing with what is frankly a very dire issue for the country and its population.
Right, and this dire issue, Colin, later this evening, presidential contenders face off for their second live TV debate, and this time the topic will center around social issues. That being said, what has been shared by the Liberal and Conservative presidential hopefuls with regard to efforts to boost the birth rate?
Yes, this will be the second debate of three. The first one, which they did, was on economic issues. This one on social issues. The third will be on political issues. And I think the birth rate question will be what a lot of people are watching for in this debate among the social issues they will cover. Because, yes, they've been talking, these candidates have been talking about this, but not in any particularly impressive way, to a lot of commentators anyway. The two frontrunners, Lee Jae-myung and Kim Moon-soo, they've laid out, I don't want to say details, but points of their plans of what they would implement were they to win the presidency. And there's some overlap, quite a bit of overlap actually. Talk of forming an 인구부, a population ministry, and there's always a danger of conflating or confusing founding a ministry for solving a problem. So, but it's worth a shot, I suppose. A lot of bringing in both the problem of a lack of babies and the problem of an aging population, which are, after all, two sides of the same coin together. So they propose solutions to both of these problems kind of in the same breath with related services. But Lee Jae-myung, if you look at, he is currently, I believe, the front runner in the election. If you look at what he's said so far about raising the birth rate, he's mentioned solutions or proposals like raising credit limit based on the number of children in a family, or increasing the supply of public housing for newlyweds, or taking what is called often in English the baby bonus, the money paid to parents of a child in Korea, taking that baby bonus and gradually extending it so that it is eventually paid out through 18 years of a child's life, by which point they are certainly no longer a baby, so that name will have to change. But those are some of his ideas. Kim Moon-soo, whose numbers have been coming up recently, he's seen as the other strong contender in this election. He's been framing his proposals as far as the birth rate, mostly in terms of housing assistance, like financial assistance for housing. So, for example, you get married, we're going to give you 3 years of housing assistance. You have 1 child, 3 more years, 2 children, 3 more years. So you could get 9 years of financial assistance with your housing under that plan. But he's also been advocating for example, widening the mandate of the marriage service industry, you could say, so that more citizens can use it. He's advocated for public wedding halls, wedding facilities, things like that, and 24-hour childcare facilities as well, 24-hour or emergency childcare facilities, which I'm sure many people who are parents in Korea will like the sound of that. I mean, who knows if the ones who are going to become parents on the fence about it will change their mind because of that, but I know the parents who are already here will be happy to hear about that if they believe it will be implemented. But recently there was a viral video on YouTube called "Is Korea Over?" in English, or "Korea is Over," I think. It was more definitive. "Korea is Over," this sort of animated explainer about why Korea's population is crashing and the sort of poor prospects for the country on the whole. Went extremely viral, like 12 million views in a very short span of time. Many views from Koreans, some of whom were commenting, saying essentially in Korean or English, "Oh, I'm Korean. We know this is a problem. We just don't want to acknowledge it. Politicians won't do anything." It was often about politicians. They don't want to do anything. But part of me says, there's only so much a politician can do. It may be a solvable problem. It's not necessarily it's not necessarily something that can be solvable entirely by the government. But a little too much, I don't want to say faith, but a little too much responsibility is offloaded onto the state in this case, at least judging by the comments on this viral video.
Right. Staying with presidential pledges by the candidates this time around, Kelly, both Lee Jae-myung and Kim Moon-soo also shared intentions to frame out policies to support families with furry friends. What do you suppose is the importance of such intentions for Korea going forward?
Oh man, this is an interesting topic for me because I think there's often a connection drawn between the rapid rise of pet ownership, particularly among young single women, and the falling of the birth rate in this country. And sometimes I think that conflation is heavily misguided. I don't think that women are choosing their dogs over their shot at motherhood. I think that women like dogs and they like babies, but one is a lot more difficult to take on than the other, and they don't have to be mutually exclusive. But I will say, I think Korea has kind of been undergoing some rapid changes in terms of animal welfare. Korea has a bad rap on the global stage because of the former dog meat industry, which is basically dwarfed to almost nothing at this point. And I just want to also throw out there that eating dogs is not a common thing here. But You know, with this, I think the intention from both candidates is to reduce the burden financially of pet ownership and to increase animal welfare in the country, and maybe connecting it to the birth rate. Maybe there's an idea that if we make it less expensive on both fronts in terms of rearing an animal and a child, people will be more likely to do both. I don't know if that's the mentality, but just sticking to the animal welfare part, Lee Jae-myung has pledged to basically enact a basic animal welfare act, which is something that South Korea probably needs at this point, and to establish an animal welfare promotion agency. I mean, I think you could argue this is good for South Korea's PR. And certainly there are issues in Korea with affordability of taking care of pets, animal abandonment. And speaking of the family unit, a large driver of pet abandonment in this country is people feeling that they have to get rid of their dog or their cat once they have a child. And so maybe some of this is aimed at that. And some of the contenders have pledged to promote a pet insurance system and to reduce surprise billing at veterinarian offices. So I think the idea, beyond just promoting animal welfare and kind of regulating the animal and pet care industry, some of this might be aimed at reducing financial burden, promoting rearing of children and animals at home together. And I think some of it is kind of built around this cultural critique or mythology, or maybe there's some truth to it, this argument that people are, you know, foregoing the baby stroller for the pet stroller, as if that is really the problem with the birth rate here, which I would argue it's not. That was just my opinion. But I do think that these are, you know, these proposals could be very good for people regardless, and animals.
Right, of course. Kelly, let's now move on to another story about Korea carried by the foreign media. The police here recently sought an arrest warrant for a digital journalist for publishing a false article related to the short-lived martial law here in the country. Now, a Seoul court recently rejected the arrest warrant as of now. That being said, could you walk us through this particular news story?
Yeah, this is a bizarre news story. In the 8 years that I've been here, I haven't seen anything quite like this. And I think some of the mystery around it is, to be honest with you, the reporting has left a lot of room for questions on this so far. We haven't covered it. I haven't covered it, so what I know about it is from reading other foreign media. But essentially, there is some kind of journalist, foreign journalist, who reported that 99 Chinese spies were arrested the day that President Yoon declared martial law, which just even the number 99 kind of sounds strange and like clickbait to me. And so the South Korean government was essentially saying this is completely baseless. It's not true. The report itself cites anonymous sourcing, and it's for like a Chinese digital media outlet that is not well known or has a very good reputation. And so, you know, there was an arrest warrant sought for this individual who was not named publicly. And as you mentioned, it has been rejected so far. I think part of the intrigue around it is just the strangeness around this in general. I mean, South Korea has been reckoning with things like fake news, but this seems like an odd fake news story to crack down upon when, for instance, some of the rioting around the presidential office in the last couple of months was built on conspiracy theories, you know, peddled by YouTubers. So I just find it kind of an odd story in general. Foreign journalists have a tendency, and there haven't been too many paying attention to this case, but have a tendency to focus on these kind of stories, maybe because there's some potential press freedom concerns here. But South Korea, generally speaking, although it has issues with things like defamation laws and being able to criminally or civilly, you know, pursue journalists in the courts for reporting the truth, generally speaking, South Korea has pretty good press freedom.
Right. And in the meantime, though, Colin, concerns continue to mount over the presence of, or the spread of fake news, especially as we count down 11 days to the presidential election. That being said, what would you recommend, Colin, to ensure perhaps access to accurate news?
Yes, well, we have to presume that people are looking for non-fake news in the first place, right? Some people, fake news is exactly what they desire. They want to be told what they already agree with, or sort of a more intense version of what they already think. But, you know, that's always going to be the case. And there always are going to be people who would like to balance that out in their lives. And so I'd always recommend diversifying your portfolio. If you're following Korean news, or rather news about Korea, you can read foreign sources, you can read domestic sources as well. Even in English, there are both. So you can even sense some differences there. You know, follow your favorite YouTubers by all means, but also follow different types of sources. You know, some sources are more institutional, some are more individual. Those two can balance out, of course. And it's not like the YouTubers are always wrong either, but you can't evaluate, you know, is this YouTuber right or wrong, or is this social media account right or wrong? You can't evaluate it unless you have some grounding in the subject. So it's like, if it's the Korean elections, whenever it comes to be presidential election time, there's a book I recommend called Top-Down Democracy in South Korea by a political scientist named Eric Mobrand, and he explains in detail how the Korean political system came to be and the nature of it and why it's different from other countries and why it's not like some of the countries that foreigners come from here. So if you get a bit of background knowledge, it goes a long way. If you read things that are not news related to the subject of the news, you'll be better equipped to just judge, does this sound true or false? Does this seem like it's fake or not fake, or it's somewhere on the spectrum between fake and real? But a lot of it does come down to the individual media consumer, as usual.
Right. Let's move on to something lighter now. Yes. Colin, so Seoul, capital Seoul, has been named the top leisure city in Asia for this year by US travel publication Global Traveler. And in recent times, K-hiking, it's emerging as a must-do activity here in the country for foreign visitors. How do you explain this interest?
It's the first time I've heard the term K-hiking, but I'm not surprised to hear it as well. I mean, Korean travel has become more and more popular. Korea has become a destination for generations who, you know, do a lot of traveling. I mean, it's a big boomer trip, as I hear, among Americans, but even young people, or even more so young people, have been coming here for a while. And hiking is really seen, I think, as the province of slightly older people in Korea. But this sort of idea of K-hiking, of getting the full gear on and bringing your bottle of makgeolli up to the top and drinking it there, that's catching on as sort of a hiking culture. And one thing that foreigners often are impressed by here in Korea when they go hiking is that you can get to a mountain easily. You can get on the subway and you can ride pretty much straight to the beginning of the slopes. So that's something you don't get in most countries. Maybe not any Seoul is promoting it that way, that this is the only world capital where you can take the train straight from the center city to the mountain and you go hike it. Fair enough. And catering to the sort of foreigner interest in hiking, there have been these hiking tourism centers, I guess you could call it, established on, I think, Bukhansan, Bugaksan, and Gwanaksan, I believe. That's the newest one. If there's an ak in the name, by the way, viewers, it's a harder mountain to climb. That's something I learned recently. So if you're looking for a challenge, go to an ak-having mountain. But these centers provide services for, of course, foreigners in different languages. And whatever you would need, I guess they're trying to provide. And they've been a pretty big success so far in the metric of how many people have been visiting them, at least, and new stories have been written and all that. But I think, yes, this may be one of the next frontiers in Korean tourism, is promoting hiking. Although the mountains were already kind of something foreigners liked here, the mountains themselves. I'll finish by saying, years ago, when I first came here, I got commissioned by a local paper to contribute to a series by foreigners on our favorite aspect of Seoul. And the editor called me and said, like, okay, just write about your favorite thing about Seoul, whatever it might be, except don't write about the mountains, because everybody writes about the mountains. So there's a lot of goodwill there for the mountains. And I think for many foreigners, they just say, they let me get out of Seoul. So it's sort of a backhanded compliment, but I think there is a lot of genuine appreciation for the mountains as well.
Right, then Kelly, we have like about 30 seconds left. With the exception of mountains here in the country, what would you recommend foreign travelers put on their to-do list?
Well, I'm not a hiker, and it's funny you asked this because a friend is having her honeymoon in Korea. I found out. She asked me for recommendations, and she said hiking is one of her primary objectives. But for me, before I heard that hiking was the objective, I thought the simple route, Seoul, Busan, and either Jeonju or Gyeongju, that's more my style, a taste of the ocean, little culture and tradition, and then a mega city where you can do everything.
Me too. Right, on that note, we'll end then. Thank you so much, Kelly, for your time and your thoughts. And Colin, thank you very much for your insights. Right, that brings us to the end of Press Perspective for this week. Have a great weekend. See you next Monday.